Welcome to today's Early Years in Mind webinar. I'm Dr. Abby Miranda, Head of Early Years and Prevention at Anna Freud. It's great to see so many of you have joined this afternoon. Early Years in Mind is a free network for anyone who's interested in supporting the development of children in the early years. Should we go to the next slide, the housekeeping? Thank you. Just to let you know that closed captions will be available through the webinar, and you can click on the closed captions button to enable these at the bottom of your screen. The chat function is disabled during the webinar, so if you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A function. There is also the option to upvote any popular questions, so I'll see them at the top of the list. We'll have BSL interpreters joining us as well. The webinar will be recorded and available on Anna Freud's YouTube channel, and there are several of our other Early Years in Mind webinars available on our channel if you'd like to check out ones you might have missed. BSL interpreters will be with us for the duration of the webinar. To make sure that they're visible on your screen, please use the option Follow the Host View, which you can find on the top right-hand side of your screen. And as always, if you have any technical issues during the webinar, please type these in the Q&A function, and a member of the Anna Freud team will be able to assist with these. This is the outline for the session. So before I introduce the speakers, I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm Dr. Abby Miranda, Head of Early Years and Prevention at Anna Freud. Early Years in Mind is a free network for anyone who has an interest in supporting children in the early years and their development. Self-regulation is a key aspect of personal, social, and emotional development. And importantly, it's what's enabled so many of you to join this webinar today, when you might have had a busy day at work and could think of nothing better to do than to switch off. So you've been able to delay your gratification by coming to this webinar. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come here and listen to our guests who will be joining us shortly. Today we're focusing on the role movement and play have in helping children to self-regulate. And this webinar is based on a free Early Years in Mind resource that was written for us by Partnership for Children. So I'm really delighted to have Jane Carter from Partnership for Children coming to talk to us today about their work, and Anne O'Connor will also be joining us today. I will hand over now to Jane to start her presentation.
Hello everyone, I'm Jane from Partnership for Children. I'm also an independent early years consultant working in nurseries, schools and children's centres. I'm really thrilled to be able to join you this afternoon to talk everything early years, which I love doing, and particularly thinking about self-regulation. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about Partnership for Children. I've popped our website address into the chat. So hopefully you'll be able to access all the information that we have on there as I'm telling you a little bit about it. Partnership for Children are a registered charity. We work in the UK and internationally too. You can see here, this is our vision. This is our aspiration. Our vision is a world in which the development of mental health and emotional resilience is part of life for every child, at home, at school, and in the community. We want to build the social and emotional skills of children across the entire primary school age range through well-evidenced programs and collaborative mutually beneficial and sustainable partnerships. Everything we do within our charity is guided by this vision. I'd like to take you to this section, our Skills for Life programmes. You can see all the different programmes that we have currently as part of our offer. We have Zip is Friends for ages 5 to 7. Zip is Friends for SEND for everyone. Apple's Friends, ages 7 to 9. Passport, ages 9 to 11. And Spark Resilience, ages 10 to 12. And you can see down here all the key aspects of all of those programmes. Now, what we wanted to do for a very long time is to add an early years offer to our programmes, because I'm hoping that you agree with me, if we can invest in our youngest children, we hopefully ensure that they are happy, confident, competent adults for the future. So we've started on our early years journey. And what we have on our website, if I can guide you to the section, down here you can see our free wellbeing activities. And we've got a particular section for our early years activities. And if you click on there, you will see that there's some downloads. So I can share what's on that section for you. During lockdown, we were really fortunate to secure some funding from Oldham Local Authority, and I was given the great honour of developing 2 sets of play-based activity cards. The main thread of both of these sets of cards for me and for Partnership for Children was connection. Definitely needed then and also needed now. So you can see in this set of cards, which is the set for teachers, for early years practitioners, they are all play-based. All of them include very easy to organise activities with key ideas of what that could look like. Hopefully you'll be able to access those from our website, and you'll be able to see them in more detail. There's also a set for families, so important during lockdown, but also important now. Follows the same pattern, things that hopefully most people will have in their house. Again, with that fundamental aim of being connected, having that co-regulation aspect included in them. That's one part of our early years journey. We've also been really lucky to secure some funding from the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF, who allowed us to take part in a research project to find out if a similar early years programme, like all the other programmes we have in place, which was focused specifically on self-regulation for 3 to 5-year-olds, would make as much impact as our other programmes do. We're really pleased to say that it did. It really made a difference to how children were able to regulate their emotions and feelings and help them build up their emotional vocabulary. That was obviously we were obviously so pleased with the outcome. Our next part of our early years adventure is we've secured yet more funding from Kavli Trust. This is going to allow us to extend our existing early years programme with more settings for a longer period of time. So we are at the point where we're recruiting settings to take part in this free programme. We're recruiting in specific areas. Those areas are Lincolnshire, where I'm from, so that's really handy. North East England, Greater Manchester, and Liverpool and Merseyside. So the flyer for that programme will be going to our Stronger Practice early years hubs next week. So if you are in any of those areas, please look out for it. You can also contact me directly, and hopefully I can share my email address after this webinar. And then obviously in Partnership for Children, we had the great honour of being invited to develop our self-regulation booklet. So my colleague Hannah wrote that booklet. She is on her current adventure of being a mummy. But as you can see, and hopefully you can hear, self-regulation, resilience, coping skills, just feeling great about yourself is everything that we're about in Partnership for Children. So that's me. I'm really looking forward to finding out what your questions are and talking even further about self-regulation.
Thank you so much, Jane, for the introduction and hearing about all the interesting work that you're doing at Partnership for Children as well. I look forward to being able to discuss that with you. And now I'd like to invite Anne to speak. So Anne O'Connor will be presenting now. Hi, Anne.
Hi, Anne. Hello, everyone. It is such a thrill, as Jane said, to be here. So my background is as a primary teacher, always specialising in the early years. I began teaching way back last century in the East End of London, where I had the privilege to work with children and families from a very wide range of cultures, languages, races, many of whom were struggling with austerity and poverty, even way back then, and whose lives held a great deal of challenge and trauma. They taught me so much about life and learning and about what really matters. Now I work as an independent early years consultant, trainer and writer, hopefully helping today's practitioners with what has become an increasingly challenging job, and I recognise that, but which on a good day still has to be the best job in the world, and certainly the most important. Some years ago, I formed a working partnership with Anna Daly. She's a specialist early years community dance artist, and together we created Primed for Life, a consultancy and training organisation specialising in the prime areas of the EYFS. So that's physical development, personal, social and emotional development, PSED, and communication and language development. And for us at Primed for Life, we put physical development at the heart of everything we do. I became more and more fascinated in the profound fundamentalness of physical development in relation to all child development, and particularly that of the brain and our sensory and nerve systems, and how our physical development impacts on our emotional health much more than we give it credit for. Now, physical development is very often the Cinderella of the prime areas, narrowed down to gross and fine motor skills and getting enough exercise because of the obesity agenda. But when it comes to understanding how we ultimately are able or not able to self-regulate and to get on with our lives and get on with each other and get on and be comfortable with ourselves, then we need to put physical development and movement play right up there, front and centre. I'm also an adoptive parent of a child from the public care system with a huge amount of trauma in his early background. He's now an adult, still with a lot of challenges in his life. And I wish I'd known more about this body and brain stuff when he was young. I wish his poor birth mother had known about it too, when she had her babies. And I wish her mother had known it for her. And then things might have been better for him all round. Now, I think we have a better handle on children's emotional development these days, thanks particularly to the work of people like Bowlby and places like the Anna Freud Centre. There's also a lot more information out there now about the fundamental importance of movement and of our sensory systems, and more than just the usual 5 that we think of, because there's also interoception, our sense of the internal state of our bodies. Things like feeling hungry, feeling pain, but also feeling excited or agitated. There's proprioception. That's our sense of our position in the world around us. It's a bit like our internal sat-nav. And then there's the vestibular system. That's our sense of balance. But more than that, it's our sense of gravitational security. It's like our internal spirit level. But all of this isn't as widely known or spoken about yet. But then again, it did take a long time for us to really appreciate what Bowlby was banging on about. And for all it's still attachment theory, he did seem to get hold of something that's very important in human development. And it is true that our knowledge of child development is constantly growing and shifting. But we ignore new information about children's physical and brain development at our peril. And particularly now in these extra challenging times when children and families find themselves for all sorts of reasons in circumstances that are less than the best. It's not just that children maybe aren't developing well in the prime areas. It's that each of the prime areas contributes to and is influenced by development in both of the other prime areas. They are, after all, intertwined in every activity and every experience for a young child. So that if one prime area isn't getting what it needs to develop, then it will likely affect the development of the other 2. So the likelihood is that if we were to pay more attention to children's physical development, then we might actually boost development in the other areas too. That's why we need to start paying more attention to children's physical development, because it can actually help boost the other prime areas and ultimately boost later learning in the specific areas too. And I do say this at every opportunity, but my hat goes off to all of you practitioners out there who are working with children and families and who are having to cope with all the added complexity of these times, whilst you're juggling ever more ridiculous targets and goals, legislated by people who definitely don't know that children don't just move because they want to, they move because they have to, because they have a biological drive that comes from their brains and their bodies working together to tell them to move in different developmental ways at different stages of life. And that the more we don't enable that movement, even try to prevent it, because way back in history, the Victorians decided that sitting still was the best way for children to learn, then we are missing the point that their movement is the learning. I'll repeat that. Movement is the learning. I'm always quoting Nicolette Sauder, who said, if we want our children to move mountains, we first have to let them get out of their chairs. And it's the movement that children are driven to do for themselves that interests me, because it seems that that is the movement that has the most impact on our physical mastery, our physical skills, on our brain development, and of course, on children's enthusiasm and motivation to continue moving as they get older. And we know that has to be a good thing, eh? Because we pretty much are going to need them to metaphorically move those mountains in terms of sorting out all the problems that we've left behind for when they grow up and they take over running our planet, or what we've left of it anyway. So that's me, very quickly.
Thank you so much, Anne. There were so many interesting things that you just said, and I'm really excited now to invite Jane back so we can have the next part of our session, which is our panel discussion. And while we're having our panel discussion, I'll keep an eye on questions that attendees have raised in the question and answer box and see if there's anything that we can ask at the end of the session when we have a few minutes for you both to answer. But I hope the audience enjoys this next part of the discussion, and Jane and Anne, I hope it's enjoyable for you too. So I wanted to, well, firstly to say thank you for all the interesting information that you shared. And just picking up on something you said, Anne, about the kind of the three prime areas being interlinked. Could you both just tell me a bit about why, so we at Anna Freud thought it was important to write the self-regulation guide, and just what both of your perspectives are on self-regulation and why it's important for children's learning and overall development. So who would like to go first?
Go ahead, Jade, if you like.
Oh, I will, thank you. I think self-regulation is that drive that drives everything. And I'm just listening to you, Anne. I absolutely agree with that physical element being part of that. I think there's no better feeling for anybody, whether you're 2, 32, 52, than a sense of, I can do this, I'm okay, I'm ready for this. And I know we talk a lot about self-regulation, but for me, it's also co-regulation that needs to come first. And for co-regulation, it all goes back to us, doesn't it, as practitioners, as adults who are supporting our very youngest children. But I would argue everyone needs the element of co-regulation. And that's why it's so important that we can get together as professionals. There's strength in numbers. Every time we meet, whether it's virtually or if it's face to face, I feel that we have that sense of unity there, particularly as early years practitioners. And we know, don't we, that we can make the biggest difference to our children, all our children, but particularly those who might have some interesting, trickier things going on in their little lives. So for self-regulation, I think it comes to the ambition and the vision of the adults, knowing that that's what I want to do as the adult. I want to come in and be in that co-regulation world with that youngest child. I want that opportunity to spend time with you, talking to you, rolling around with you, stretching with you, but having that quality time together. And once we get that co-regulation in place, it's that little bit of a glow, that little bit of a fizz, a healthy fizz in your body as the adult and their body as the child, which I think brings the power. It's that element of motivation that just spurs them on.
Oh, I love how you described it as the fizz. That's such a nice way of describing it. And yeah, I think I really like, Jane, the way you brought it back to the role of the adult in this as well, because often we can focus on what the child needs to do and we almost kind of extract ourselves from the equation, don't we, as the adult there. Anne, I'll let you come in and say what your thoughts are.
Well, I obviously agree with everything Jane was saying, and my thumbs went up
Yes,
when she mentioned co-regulation, of course. And I think for me, I think of the process of becoming more self-regulated, and I do think it's a process. I do think it's something we should not be expecting regularly of very young children. I think we start to see the beginnings of it, ideally, but that it's not something we should expect our very youngest children to be able to do. And that actually, let's face it, none of us can manage it 100% of the time. So it's very much depending on the circumstances. I think a lot of it is about that sense of, I've got this. And I think that growing trust in ourselves to have it comes from our growing trust in others to have been able to co-regulate for us at the beginning, to hold our difficult feelings before we were able to hold them for ourselves. And I think it's that learning to trust others that we know is very much part of the attachment cycle. It's this, the co-regulation cycle is very much the same as the attachment cycle, because the two are going together there. And that as we learn to trust other people, that someone will come and feed us, that someone will change our wet nappy, that someone will help us feel a little bit better when we're out of sorts. Someone will help us solve this problem that we're not yet able to solve for ourselves. We begin to learn to trust other people, but it's that process that also enables us to begin to learn to trust ourselves. And we can't do that. And I live with and have lived with, not just with the children I've worked, but also in terms of my own parenting experience, a child who has completely missed out on that early attachment cycle, that early co-regulation. And I know just how difficult it is to go beyond resilience, in the sense that, resilience is, what is it? The saying, resilience is more than rugged individualism. It's actually, it's something, it comes from nurture. And we don't become resilient by all the time having to face hard knocks by ourselves. It's how other people, ideally the important people in our lives from day one, how they help us to arrive at that place, where actually resilience is that sense of, things are really difficult, but I've got this because I still trust myself to be okay, to be enough. And it kind of feels to me as though that's at the root, the heart of all emotional well-being, physical well-being too. I trust myself. I'm okay. I am enough.
Thanks, Anne. That was a really, you had so many interesting things to share there. And I like the idea of trust that really came out strongly, trusting others and then trusting yourself. And that theme of trust really got me thinking about, when we're talking about movement and play here, and how you said, children are not, earlier that you said children are, they're meant to move, they're primed to move. And it got me thinking about how adults as well, sometimes do we trust our own bodies enough around our own need to movement? And most of us are probably sitting down while we're watching this webinar, but I'm just wondering about your reflections on how much, I suppose, we're primed as adults to sit still, and that kind of influences the way we support or manage children in the settings or the places we work.
Well,
Yes.
we are a good role model, aren't we, for our children? They're great lookers, they're great listeners. You've probably had experience where you can hear children saying something like you've said, interesting sometimes, always funny. But we are that role model, aren't we, in every aspect of their life. So we need to be presenting that kind of narrative, that story, that it is useful, it's helpful, it's healthy that we look after our bodies in so many different ways, by what we put in it. Are we out in the fresh air? How can we move it? So we have that element of celebrating what our bodies can do rather than what they can't do. And I think sometimes that's really tricky, isn't it? It's tricky for a grown-up, never mind somebody who is just starting off on their journey of being an amazing young child. There's such a focus on, well, I can't do this, I'm not very good at this. And I know there's been different things put in place where we're trying to twist that and turn it around. So I'm not good at this yet, you know, that positive mindset. But I do think it comes back to us as that role model. And just picking up on what Anna's mentioned about the element of trust, I think it goes hand in hand for me when I'm thinking more about it. That subject knowledge that we can offer practitioners so they develop that good bank of understanding. Obviously, lots of activities so they can put it into practice with their own children. But I also believe, and just listening to Anne, I was doing lots of nodding and agreement. There's that element of us as a person as well. That needs to come into that mix. It needs to come into that recipe of the way that we support our children. If we don't have that bit where we're actually a person and they see us being a living, breathing person and modeling to them, then I think we're literally giving them knowledge and we're giving them skills, but we're not allowing them or showing them or giving them the opportunity to how to blend those things together.
Thanks, Jane. Anne, did you like to come in?
Yes, I'd agree. And I think, again, kind of, I can relate both personally and professionally in this context, in that we talk a lot about self-care and practitioner well-being. And yet I also know how difficult, let's say impossible, it can be to look after yourself when you are on your knees. And I think we also have to acknowledge, whether it's for parents today or whether it's for practitioners who are really, really up against it, just how difficult it can be. And so on the one hand, I totally appreciate how, if you are so tired that you cannot actually imagine how you might possibly want to go outside and run around and dance around with children, I get it. I absolutely get it. I also know that from a lot of the work I've been doing lately, a fantastic project with Anna up in Cumbria, where we have been dancing with children as part of continuous provision. We've just been playmating alongside them. And how, when we are able to build the confidence of practitioners to see them get back inside their own bodies again, to feel the child inside them who used to skip and hop and climb things and roll around on the grass. And actually seeing that if we give practitioners time, if we acknowledge for them just how important physical development is, we can't on the one hand say that you've got to model it and then actually pile on loads of pressures for them to be doing other things, because actually it takes time to build up your confidence again as a physical person, as someone who moves, if that's not your natural predisposition. And let's face it, it was everybody's natural predisposition once, probably until school got in the way. Because for an awful lot of people, that is the barrier, that is the block, you know. So it does feel important, exactly as Jane said, that we recognize our responsibility, but that we also give ourselves back that opportunity to feel okay. And working with practitioners over a period of time, being gentle with them, being gentle with ourselves, we've actually seen that shift. And we've seen smiles come back onto adults' faces as well as children, because they've gone, oh, that felt nice, as they were rolling around on the floor. When do we give practitioners permission to lie down on the floor? And yet that's probably the best place for most early learning to take place. So why shouldn't we be down there rolling around with them?
That's really, I think that's such a lovely image of practitioners getting in touch with their inner child and being able to enjoy movement again, and linking back to what you said earlier, Jane, about you can't do this yet, and developing that sense of confidence in your ability to move. And you mentioned school, and I think I was just thinking about a general theme I've heard from early years practitioners and people who work in the sector, that they often feel like there's a bit of a kind of, sometimes a bit of a divide between them and teachers and school staff in the way things are done. And it's often kind of expected that early years practitioners should be more like school, in terms of getting children, you know, ready for that kind of learning that they'll have in the primary school environment. So I would just like to hear some of your thoughts around that, and I guess to help us to understand, and early years practitioners, you know, if they are trying to rationalise why children need to do things differently to children in the school phase, why, in your view, that would be.
Shall I jump in? Literally jump in. I would say children in school still need to be doing it, of course, wouldn't I? But one of the interesting things about movement and physical development is that being still is the ultimate form of movement. We don't start by being still and then learn how to move. We start literally before we're born, we are moving. It's our first form of communication from within the womb. We come out moving, and with even, you know, with all sorts of, with the best will in the world, bits of us will move as well as they can. Yeah. And this idea that we have to learn how to be still has got, it's completely topsy-turvy. It's the wrong way around. Children need to move so that one day they will be still, so that they can have control, have physical mastery of their bodies in order to be still. But that is a process, and a child who cannot be still is telling you, I need more moving. That would be my answer. And if you look at, I'm not sure if it's exactly the same now, but certainly in Japan, where they used to have very free and very active early years, right up until about the age of 8, I think, very physically, with very little of the caution that we have here. Their children would be very physically active. After a certain age, the Japanese culture puts a lot of pride and a lot of emphasis on being still. And Japanese people are very good, this is a working stereotype, at being still, generally because of all that extra movement they had when they were younger. So forgive me for the stereotype and the, but that is, from what I've seen, tells us very strongly that the more we inhibit our young children's movement, the less good they will be at being still, when perhaps we might need them to be still later on.
And that sounds to me, just listening to you, taking it in, I feel like many people listening as well might be thinking, wow, that's really flipped the way I've kind of thought about things. And actually you kind of almost think you need more practice being still in order to be better at being still. So that
you need more practice moving in order to be still. You don't need the practice at being still, because if that comes before all of the moving has been done, the being still practice is just, it's a child controlling their body, but with no space left in their brain for learning anything. All of your effort and your energy and your neural processes are going on trying to keep your body still. Yeah, that 4-year-old sat cross-legged on the carpet is not taking things in as well as they would if they were allowed to move more naturally, because all the energy is going on the brain. Sorry to interrupt you there, but that felt important to
I think
state.
really important about how it's like a trade-off that's taking place then. And yeah, you're seeing a child that sits still and I guess they look like they're learning, but how much are they actually learning because of how much they're having to control themselves and that desire to move. That yeah, that's it's
Imagine yourself in that situation in a lecture room. If you had to sit absolutely still, staring ahead of you, how much would you take in?
I guess it's similar thinking about, you know, if a child's finding it difficult to write, what you probably don't do is give them loads of writing to do because you've recognised that it's a journey. So you think differently, you think kind of like around that end result. And I wonder, just listening to you, Anne, we probably need to think in a similar way. And that goes back to my point of, you know, embedding that really secure subject knowledge of maybe what it looks like when a child progresses through any aspect of learning. Do we understand what the expectations are? And then do we then understand how we can support them to meet ultimately what we want them to get to? But just thinking about, Abby, that you mentioned, maybe there's that difference in perception between early years practitioners within a setting and early years practitioners or other practitioners in a school. I think from my experience, the more that we can bring everybody together who supports children in early years, remembering that the early years goes right from birth to 5 and probably a bit beyond if we're really thinking about it. You just happen to be, your children just happen to be in different buildings. They're all working towards the same kind of expectations. They should have the same experiences. They should have the same right to take part in that curriculum. So the more that we can bring practitioners together, regardless of what it says on their badge or their lanyard, they are all practitioners, experts, supportive, nurturing. I think, again, those professional conversations will be so vital. That was definitely the case in the EEF study that I mentioned right at the beginning. We were so lucky to have such a variety of settings, some in private, voluntary and independent, some in very specific type of settings like a forest school setting, and some that were in school-based settings. But all of them were brought together to talk about the key aspect of self-regulation. And I mentioned, didn't I, that it was a success which made us really happy. It obviously made a difference to the children, but it also made a difference to the practitioners. They learned new things themselves, which, you know, is just wonderful. We continuously should be learning and reflecting, shouldn't we?
absolutely, and having that time to come together sounds like it was invaluable in the study that you spoke of. You describing the different types of settings made me think about families and families who might have different access to space for their child to move around in. And I suppose what I was thinking about is if you had any kind of advice or suggestions for families who might really be kind of struggling to support their child, and they might feel pressure, you know, like to make their child kind of, you know, not bang on the floor too loudly because it's going to upset the neighbours downstairs, or jumping on the sofa and those kind of things. So if you had any kind of suggestions for families where there might be limited space and things that you could maybe you would say as a practitioner to support those families.
So we were very aware of that when we developed those early years cards I mentioned earlier. So a set for practitioners and a set for families, because as you remember, they were developed through lockdown. So we didn't have access to anything, did we? We couldn't even go beyond our front door. And it was a very, very difficult situation for everybody, heightened emotions, lots of pressures. So that we were really mindful of that when we developed them. So we made sure the resources were hopefully available, which didn't need lots of space. But again, we were really focused on that quality adult-child interaction. So whilst it is without doubt more difficult if you've not got access to maybe the space that you would like, hopefully through our cards and the range and wealth of other activities which are out there, we've provided at least a structure, a framework. And even if you do 1, 2, or 3 of those activities, then you are going to start that co-regulation conversation with your child or children.
Thanks, Jane. Anne, I know you have some thoughts on, I think sometimes as parents you want to lead your child to do a specific activity at a specific time because you might feel like it's, convenient, or you have like a learning outcome in mind. What are your kind of thoughts around that?
Well, I suppose because a lot of the work that Anna and I have been doing in particular, and a lot of my approaches towards self-regulation are actually about we as the adult spending more time really noticing our children. So we're used as practitioners in the early years to observing, but actually we tend to think that if we're not leading or directing or setting up the exercise or the activity, that it's not as valuable, or that it doesn't have quite the same learning impact. So what we've been encouraging practitioners to do, particularly with regards to movement play, is to actually just hold back and be and watch what children are telling us through their bodies, and then to be able to mirror sometimes the tiniest of movements, a little scratch of the head or a little wriggle of the shoulder or a pushing of a chair, and then actually mirroring that activity, mirroring that movement. In that process, this is something that just takes part in the general flow of the day in continuous provision. But what the message that gives the child is that they are seen. They are really seen, and that actually the adult is interested in what they do with their body. And yeah, that can be somersaulting or, doing something very boisterous, but equally it might be something very simple. But what tends to happen is that once the child realizes the adult is interested, is seeing, and is prepared to mirror and follow, rather than be the one who's doing the leading and do that, do it like this and let's do that, that actually the child then very much enjoys taking the lead, and a movement conversation, a movement dialogue can develop. And the potential for connection there, which, it was so lovely to hear Jane say that, is so powerful, it's immense. And that's the kind of thing that it's almost like we slow it down. It doesn't have to be vigorous. It can get vigorous. I'm not saying that we never take the lead and that we don't ever show or direct, but that to take the time to just watch and be part of that dialogue together, which is something that actually, when we share that with parents, it can take a while to understand what we mean by it. But what we're sharing with parents is that it isn't all effort. Sometimes it's, connection comes from some of the simplest of things. And that actually what children choose to do with their bodies is them saying, this is where I'm at developmentally. This movement interests me. I really like doing this. I really like jumping. I really like hanging upside down off the settee. And if we as practitioners are able to help parents understand that hanging upside down off the settee is actually developing the vestibular system and is really good practice for a whole range of other things later on. even though the science might be a bit complicated, to just kind of go, no, it's okay for my child to do that. It doesn't mean they're weird, doesn't mean they'll damage their eyes, doesn't mean that they're, even though it can feel annoying, actually that might be worth more than half an hour's running around the field if the child isn't ready or interested in running around a field. I'm being a little bit simplistic, but I hope you get a sense of what I mean there, that all movement is useful. And children will tell us what interests them in their movement play.
I really liked how you described it as a movement, conversation, or dialogue, and that idea that, you know, you don't need like a massive field to run around. It can be just kind of observing where you are. And it really made me think about children who might be neurodivergent, or children with physical disabilities as well, who might have a limited range of movement, and the way that you can still kind of observe and interpret their movements, and not,
Yes.
I think sometimes what happens is children can get kind of I suppose their movements can be pathologized essentially, and we can say like that's not, you know, that's not how you should be moving.
Yeah.
And as adults, you know, you can inadvertently sometimes try to encourage children to all move in the same way or in a socially acceptable way. So I think that's a lovely idea that you could mirror movements of a child. I think it's really nice. Yeah, it's some really lovely ideas I think coming out of this. So, and the importance for children. We've actually got, so we've got 9 minutes or 8 minutes left of the webinar, and there's about 20 questions I can see in the Q&A box. So I'm actually going to start to go through some of these. So I give you a bit of time to answer some of the questions. And I think with it, yeah, there's comments as well about children with strong emotions and like aggression, and unpicking those early developmental traumas that might have happened to them early on in life, and attachment difficulties, and unpicking, helping parents to understand the importance of what they're seeing in terms of their child and how they can support them. It's quite a big question, but I suppose what I'm hearing from you both is that we're not operating from a one size fits all approach at all, really.
I think for me, it's that we've used the word connection a lot. I would add authentic connection to that. And what I mean by that is really tuning in, like Anne's mentioned a few times. What is it about that little one that is just brilliant? What do I know about them? What are they telling me? What are they showing me? And again, that comes back to us as professionals investing our knowledge and our time and ourselves in getting to know that child. And we can do that, can't we, with things like this? We can do our own studies and research, but there's nothing better than actually spending that quality time with our children. And bringing in our families into that conversation, I think will only strengthen that feeling that we are all there together for your precious little bundle. This is what they're really good at. Do you notice when they do something like this? I've noticed it when they come to nursery. Have you noticed it at home? That's great. Shall we both carry on noticing those kind of things? And once we've got that shared understanding, then we can support the families to then support the children in a very collaborative way.
I really like the way you described that, almost like reframing of something that you might have seen in the setting and playing it back to the family in a way they might not have thought of it. I imagine that would really help to kind of shift thinking in a lot of cases about how they're interpreting what their child is doing.
I guess we want to support the big people to support the little ones as well. So
And
the way that we can do that in that lovely nurturing coaching manner will just make that biggest difference, won't it?
Absolutely. And I'm just reflecting on actually how we've talked about in terms of the children, I think quite a lot about movement, and in some ways less about self-regulation for the child, because I really feel like what we're having through this what's coming through for me anyway through this conversation is self-regulation is not a kind of goal, it's like it's an ongoing process, and it involves us being able to self-regulate in order so we can co-regulate with the child. So actually that focus on the adult is that kind of shift makes sense in regard with regards to what we're talking about.
Yes, there are some little mantras that I've seen them around and about on the internet that I think are really helpful there. One of them, the biggest one probably, is lend them your calm. And you can't lend someone, and this is particularly important when co-regulating, but you can't lend somebody your calm if you can't find it for yourself. And then that's actually, you know, a lot of when I do training on self-regulation, I spend quite a bit of time talking about how we regulate ourselves in the heat of the moment, at the height of the day, at lunchtime when everything's falling apart, how we're able to do that, but also about making the most of the quiet times, the still time, still as in still times that are about snuggles and just being rested and relaxing. And this was something we found again on this project, that children actually enjoy of their own volition being allowed to just slump and lie down and cuddle under a blanket or hug a cushion. But it's of their own volition, which is the key thing there. But actually it's those quiet times that help the adults to also access their calm, because you need to be able to recognize what calm felt like in order to be able to return to that calm place when you've become dysregulated. So if you've never actually really focused on what feeling calm feels like, so we do that for ourselves, we do that with the children as well. You know, you are having that lovely quiet time. You and a couple of other children are snuggled up and you're, you know, you've got a blanket and you've got a book and this feels really good. Can you feel it in your tummy? Where do you feel it? Where do you feel relaxed? Those kinds of questions that we can explore in those good moments to then be able to help them get back to how that felt. That's also tied up with interoception and how you feel inside, but that's for another day probably.
And that reminds me of what you said earlier about trust as well, because I suppose you're teaching the child to trust their own bodies by listening to their bodies
Yes,
and what they need.
exactly. The more you can know and understand, and the sooner you can register. You know, we talk about being hangry, don't we?
Yeah.
Where you're so hungry, you've become angry. Well, actually, if we are good at recognizing the early stages of being hungry, then we're less likely to get to a place where we're hangry. The same can be true of agitation or overexcitement or anxiety, to recognize it early so that then you can bring yourself back with some good, healthy, soothing strategies, which of course is also part of self-regulation.
I also think it's really important to vocalize through your words. So we talk about modeling lots, don't we? When maybe model things and actions and activities, but modeling the language that's attached to some of those feelings
Yes.
is absolutely vital.
Yes.
I guess sometimes we can assume that children know what the feeling is and even what it's called. But you know, you're just starting off on your little journey. Why should you know any of those things? So the more that we can do that thinking out loud in using our own language,
Absolutely.
the children then grab hold of that and they love playing around with those words. But it all supports them to work towards being those confident, independent adults that we want them to be.
They can also take the lead. If you show them that you are anxious because you've forgotten to bring your lunch, you can ask them if they can help you. What can I do? I'm feeling really worried about. They are great at coming up with ideas.
They are, yes.
And that again shows them that this isn't just something that grown-ups do to little children, sort them out. They can help us as well. But that whilst they're doing that, they're also developing the skill.
It's really lovely. I think a really kind of human way of working to show that, you know, adults aren't perfect, and we don't only have kind of, you know, those good emotions, we go through a whole range of emotions, and actually that the child can help. That's really a lovely, empowering, I think, point. And you've both emphasized, I think, that real interconnection between all of the areas of the earliest foundation stage, and how you know, how we support through using lots of different approaches, and they're interlinked. That reminder, sorry, has just popped up on my computer to say it's 7:30 now, and we're at the 5:30, sorry, not 7:30. We're at the end of our webinar, and it was an absolute pleasure. There are clearly, there's so much interest, I think, in this webinar. There are a few questions about links to different resources that I think we can post some of those and send them out after the session for those of you who are interested. Please do as well check out on our YouTube channel the webinar recording when it's available, and share it with colleagues if you found it useful. But I'd like to say a big thank you to Anne and Jane, to our BSL interpreters, Lynn and Rob, and to the team at Anna Freud for helping us to put on this webinar, and for all of you for taking the time in your kind of early afternoon, late afternoon, early evening to join us as well. And please, if you get time to fill out our post-event feedback form, it really helps us to plan our next events and to know how helpful and useful they are for you. So a huge thank you again, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.